what Michael just called the bureaucracy, the sort of political bureaucracy, the kind of permanent bureaucracy of Washington that also exists in the states, Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and his folk have labeled that the deep state. And when they say the deep state, that's what they mean. They mean the bureaucratic, regular $40,000 to $50,000 an hour working folks who actually maintain government. And what they understand is that what stopped Donald Trump from doing his worst is that everything he did had to grind through the sort of slowing mechanisms of bureaucracy. So it's not efficient. Politics is not efficient. That's why people are mad at Joe Biden. He can't get things done because you have this bureaucracy, you have the Senate, they've got a, ability to filibuster. All of that slow motion stuff slows down extreme policy. Trump gets back in, he gets rid of all those people. And then he says, we're not having an election. I'm staying. Well, who's going to stop him, boo? Who's going to check him? If the local bureaucrats don't do it, that's who stopped him from doing the coup the first time. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm glad Michael's here because this is I actually think this is a great moment because it provides clarity to the fact that our democracy is and has always been fragile in nature. It is very dependent. It's not just dependent on the structure of the Constitution. It's dependent on good people holding office and good people serving that actually have loyalty to the Constitution. And I think what Donald Trump, if you asked him what his biggest regret was putting certain people in certain positions that ended up not doing what he wanted. If you think about this, if there was a different Secretary of Defense at the time at the end of 2020, what the result would have been. If there was a different vice president, what the result would have been. If there was a different FBI director, what would the result have been? All three of which of those people, Donald Trump has gone out of his way in the last year just to rip on in the course of this. And so it's not only the immense bureaucracy that Donald Trump, it's key people in positions of power, which actually is such a great lesson for us in democracy, how important the people who occupy certain spaces are in preserving our democracy. And I'll also add one thing to the Hitler analogy. It wasn't just the American media. The German media never took him seriously. They were like, oh, he's kind of a joke. If you go back and look at, oh, he's kind of a joke. He'll be okay. We have this system in place. There's no worries about it. And then in the aftermath, where he was elected, he was legitimately elected. Then you had people who were served in power and said, we're going to give him these positions because we can control him. That was basically their stance. We'll give him these things because he'll be able to be controlled by us, and that'll be a good thing, and we'll be able to hold power. And look what happened.
Right, exactly. Ditto Maduro in Argentina, Bolsonaro in Brazil, same thing. They're treated as a joke. They're kind of funny. They're kind of glib. And you're like, they're really not a problem. They're sort of entertaining. I want to read you a line from a Washington Post piece, because I think the other piece of it is that the people on the ground don't fear the consequences of this kind of leadership. The Washington Post quoted a voter named Orlando Monk. And he's from Wisconsin, which is one of the tiny number of swing states that will decide the election. He says if it's between them, meaning Biden and Trump, I'm going to say this. Trump was hilarious. He was hilarious, said Monk, 43, who lives in the Milwaukee area. Biden, meanwhile, has not delivered the change he expected, leaving Monk unsure. I would say it's kind of up in the air. Michael Beschloss, this is the challenge. Joe Biden is slowed down by politics and bureaucracy, by the slowing mechanisms in the United States Senate, which means you need 60 votes to get things. People don't understand that minutia. They just know he can't get what he wants, whereas Trump says, I'm going to ban all Muslims. He banned all Muslims. Trump says, I'm going to build a wall. He pretends I built a wall. Trump says, right, I'm going to rip babies away from their mothers if they try to come over this border. Stephen Miller says that. And suddenly babies are being ripped out of their mother's hands at the border. His autocracy is efficient. And so for a lot of people, they're like, I'd rather have that. And he's funny.
No, that's right. And I'm hoping against hope that by 11 months from now, even Mr. Monk and other people who were saying things like this will understand that the choice of November 2024 is most likely going to be between democracy, as flawed and faltering as it is, and dictatorship, autocracy that are going to take our rights away. Look at the reaction of women and men to the cancellation of Roe v. Wade. That's what happens in the best of America when you take freedom away. We can hope that that is what's going to happen. But, you know, I shudder to think that after all the decades that our American soldiers fought fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, Imperial Japan, Soviet dictatorship for 46 years, we're going to throw all of this away so gingerly. I can't bring myself to believe that that's going to happen.
Right. And I think people should remember when you're speaking of abortion, one of the first things that these guys do and threaten to do is take away the rights of women, because controlling women is always part of the plan. And banning abortion is always a part of it. Right. It's a signal. And, you know, to go back, Matthew, to the minutia part, because I think this is the thing is I say this all the time to my poor beleaguered team. How do elections happen? Elections don't happen because there's some, you know, giant, you know, machine that turns on and elections happen. They happen because individual people at the bureaucratic level in the states begin the process. It's an honor system. They just believe there's supposed to be an election, and so they begin the process. What if they don't? Let me put up a map. These are the 19 states where 25 election deniers hold statewide positions with election oversight power. In other words, if they believe that Donald Trump cannot be returned to office by an election, and they just say, you know what, we ain't doing it. Trump's in. We like him. We don't want him to be replaced. He stays. Who's going to stop that? Nobody. Who's going to stop it?
That's been the most nefarious. One of the most nefarious part of this is the attack on our election infrastructure. The people that are the secretaries of state in Michigan and in Wisconsin and in Illinois and over that have been physically and violently threatened in the course of this. Not only them, but local people that actually volunteer to serve at the polls. And then, so you put those states up where you have election deniers in office, and then you overlap that where states where all these massive amount of threats that have occurred, where it's become difficult to recruit people to actually man the polls. And this is a recipe, as Michael has alluded to or said, this is a recipe for not only an infrastructure in Washington, D.C., but a threatened infrastructure in the country that actually holds the elections done by little old men and women around the country who do they want to be visited by MAGA people at their home and threatened by the point of a gun in the course of this, which is what has happened. You saw what happened in Georgia in the course of this, people that are just trying to do their service and fulfill a civic duty. Those people are now under threat. And now they have to ask themselves, I love America. I believe in America. Do I want to put myself and my family at risk just to hold an election?
Yeah, there used to be a senator from the state of Mississippi who used to say the best way to keep a black person, he didn't say black person, from voting is to visit them the night before with a gun. Michael, let's talk about the other things, because there are some fundamental anti-democratic aspects to our structure of our elections that also work against democracy and work for Trump. He only has to really carry a majority, 50.1, 50 plus 1 in 10 states, basically, because, because of the Electoral College, it's gone down from 26 states that used to really be swing states and matter to like 10. Neither party will probably contest Florida this time. It's now seen as deep red like Alabama. So you're talking about maybe 10 states that decide who wins. The rest of the country is just stuck with the result.
No, that's exactly right. And a system, and I loved what Matt said. I agree with everything he said. Go on to take a look. We have Citizens United. We have corporate and private money pouring into this system in a way that you can't imagine. That is not progressive money for the most part. Those are people who would be perfectly content to accustom themselves to a Donald Trump dictatorship. If it comes to that, they're already showing that they are. And the other thing, Joy and Matt, take a look at, we have thought in the past that when Americans were confronted with the loss of our liberties, that would be a deal breaker. It doesn't seem to be yet. And we're on the verge of a situation. Look right now, Donald Trump, I'll ask both of you, why is Donald Trump in public saying, I will be a dictator from day one and presumably afterwards? I will use the Defense Department in a way that hasn't been done before. I'm going to talk about terminating the Constitution. I would expect, Matt has this, history as a campaign genius, of knowing that usually you'd expect a candidate who intends to do those things not telling you until Election Day. This is the beginning of the intimidation that we're talking about. I think the reason he's making these threats is to get people to be quiet and to knuckle under even 11 months before his possible election. Please, everyone who's watching, all of our friends, beware.